Greetings, this is video 2 of the illegal crackdown on fiancé visa fraud by an arrogant, incompetent, and corrupt U.S. federal government. You should watch video 1 first. Okay, a new topic here. Why are U.S. citizens in legitimate relationships afraid to use the system that was designed for them? This is like, our previous videos where we talked about the IRS. Or there was a time when the IRS would say, come in on Tuesday and bring boxes, and you have a all morning long appointment for, an audit. And people would have to, rent a dolly and go down in the basement and get all their boxes and put them in their car and then wheel them into the IRS office because they were summoned for an audit. So a lot of people are afraid, am I going to wind up owing, tens of thousands of dollars? Nobody thinks, yeah, there's a possibility that you could be getting money back after an audit, but people are afraid of the bad things. Same with the fiancé visa. Why are U.S. citizens afraid to use the system? Because if you're a U.S. Citizen Petitioner and you have a foreign fiancé, even though you're in a bona fide relationship and you know it, there's a good chance you're going to get denied. It's only a 2% chance, but it just depends. I mean, do you have a high number of indicators? If you have a high number of indicators, it might be a 50% chance. So we're going to take a look at this. So this was a recent addition to this presentation where I decided to look up fiancé visa, afraid and denial, and I looked this up a number of ways. I-129F, afraid of interview, afraid of denial, and I get all these things. Yeah, everybody's afraid. Everybody's afraid of the interview, especially. And why is that? There's a good reason for it. Why are all couples who are applying for a fiancé visa afraid of the process? Because they know how to read, and they see on these visa forums people writing in, message, I don't know how this happened. We got denied. How can we get denied? We're married, or we're not married. We've been living together for, 5 years in one example that was a denial. We have all this proof that we have a bona fide relationship. How could this happen that we get denied? Well, because, as I mentioned previously, if the USCIS and Department of State, the consulate, if they approved every fiancé visa, we'd be in a world of hurt because there would be all kinds of criminals entering this country because there's a 100% approval rate. So what is wrong with this process is the current policies and procedures are just totally incapable of identifying the target populations of terrorists, sham marriages, human trafficking, other forms of fiancé visa fraud. They can't detect the target populations, and they can't approve everyone. So do the math. What's going to happen? So this is, let's see, because the U.S. Department of State is especially arrogant, incompetent, and corrupt. The USCIS, they're using a crazy indicator system, but they're sending it to the Department of State, and the Department of State is kind of under pressure. We've got to deny some visas. We can't approve all of them. That would be bad. I mean, if we approved all of them, the word would get out, and terrorists would be entering the country every week, and they'd be. Some females that don't know much about automatic weapons would go up to, rent an ISIS groom, husband.com and find all kinds of guys that can hold an automatic weapon and kill Americans. So we'd be in a world of hurt if they approved everything. And they can't identify the target audiences because of arrogance, incompetence, and corruption on a massive scale. So here's an example, the previous slide said the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. This is the Department of State. They're also especially arrogant, corrupt, and incompetent for allowing hundreds of sham marriages, to get through. And this is the Department of State being arrogant, incompetent, and corrupt for allowing human trafficking to get through. So here you see, a little slide here that I put in where ICE is, again, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. They're the police of this whole fiancé visa process, of all visa processes. They're the police arm. They're the members of the they're the members of the Department of Homeland Security who carry guns and badges and handcuffs. So that's, they're law enforcement. So here, 1,437 arrested by ICE and 400 victims identified. They, came into this country and found themselves in a human trafficking situation. And then we have boo-boos. Department of Homeland Security audit finds 858 immigrants likely granted citizenship in error. It's like, whoops, just 858. So, this is incompetence, but it's going to happen anywhere. But the thing is, the government really doesn't, even though their internal audit found 858 immigrants who were granted citizenship by mistake, they don't recognize that it happens, that it's a possibility. Because if they recognize it was a possibility, then they would probably tell US Citizen Petitioners and their fiancés who are in legitimate, bona fide, loving relationships, they would tell them something about the recourse that they have if they get denied. What can I do now? Well, we don't have to tell you. We don't have to tell you that stuff. We're demigods. You're nothing. We don't have to tell you that stuff. Figure it out on your own. So anyways, all kinds of terrorists, all kinds of target populations get into the country. Terrorists, terrorism, sham marriages, human trafficking, and, mistakes, internal errors. And that's just because these guys do a scary bad job of, working. It's like, scary bad, that's a Department of State term. That was actually, it was a couple of years ago where Beijing, the U.S. Consulate in Beijing used to report air quality standards. And, Beijing was, I guess they're having a better year this year, mostly because of atmospheric issues. But a few years ago, they went off the scale. It was like the scale was, hazardous was the top thing. If the PMA 2.5 was above like 400, and they topped out at something like 600 or 800, and it wasn't on the American scale, So there was like the various levels of air conditioning have names to go with them, and hazardous was the worst one, and that would mean women and children shouldn't go outside today. So they didn't have a word for the going over 600 or 800, so they just the U.S. Consulate in Guangzhou listed the air as scary bad. That's from the Department of State. So anyways, if they are not stopping terrorists, sham marriages, human trafficking, and other visa fraud criminals, who are they keeping out of the country? It's like her. They're keeping out of the country. Most of the time it's a her. Most fiancé visa citizen petitioners are men by a pretty good margin, and most fiancés are ladies. But it goes the other way around too. I just found this picture. I didn't want to get a picture with that showed faces on here. But anyways, they're stopping your fiancé. That's who's stopping. So that's the end of that topic. Why are people afraid? Because they have good reason to be afraid. So this is the counterattack on. We're going to have a couple different topics involving the counterattack. This is proof of corruption for Department of State and Department of Homeland Security employees. So here I say becoming a politician in the USA is like having a license to be corrupt. In this section here, I'm not going to stop on every page. Pause the video and read these. Okay, I'm just going to stick on one page enough to show you what it is. But This red and black is a color scheme I put in for USCIS. So this is from the Department of Justice, United States Department of Justice. And these are USCIS employees here that are being, they had some kind of case where people were watching them. The Department of Justice was watching them, and then they arrest them, and then they, set a court date, and then they prosecute them, and then they convict them, and then these are the headlines for convictions. Okay, so this is USCIS. There's a couple of them here, a couple more. So those were, USCIS. Now we go to ICE. All of these government organizations in the cabinet, in the underneath the executive branch, in Trump's cabinet now, the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of State and their divisions, like ICE being under Department of Homeland Security, they are all susceptible to corruption. And everybody knows that. Nobody will argue that. So, don't be surprised when you see so many cases here where people are convicted by this one here is the ones on this page are U.S. Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. ICE people caught their own ICE people, taking bribes and stuff like that. So the yellow and black color scheme here is for ICE. Now we go to a different color scheme, this kind of orangish color over black. This is DHS. So this is DHS that's not USCIS. So usually these DHS people are in Washington. Not all the time, though. But anyways, they come under the higher level, Department of Homeland Security, not under USCIS. So there's a bunch of these too. Here's even one where we have a person that was a chief investigator, the department's chief investigator and deputy was placed on administrative leave, for corruption at the very top. And here's a little bit, I'll get into this later, but as you can see, the Congress enacted the Inspector General Act of 1978 to ensure integrity and efficiency in government. So both the Department of Homeland Security and the Office of Inspector General were established by Congress in 2002. But each, the Department of State also has an OIG, an Office of Inspector General, and the Inspector General's office is to, investigate internal corruption and fraud. So that's not all they do, but that's one thing that they do. That's a major thing that they do. So, this Office of Inspector General was created because why? Because it's anticipated that you're going to have corruption inside of the Department of Homeland Security. Same with the USCIS, same with the Department of State. So here's one where, the special agent in charge of the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Inspector General. So this is the Inspector General's office that's supposed to watch for corruption, but here the guy that's ahead of that got put in prison for 3 years. So, don't think that I'm some kind of extremist for saying that there's corruption in the government. There's corruption in the government, even at the highest level. So here's Department of State. And this is this is a thing here, massive abuse of power. A lot of people were caught for doing the same thing. The Department of State has, corruption, but they also have, and a lot of these are consular officers for taking bribes. So a lot of you people, you're wondering, if you went to a country like, China or Philippines or, some other kind of country where, you would think bribes take place, maybe that's why you got denied. You didn't bribe the consulate officer. I'm certainly not advising you to do that, but that could be the reason. So, more of this stuff. And the Department of State actually takes it to a higher level. of corruption. And here's an example of that. There's 2 examples in here that I found. And keep in mind, you'll see a chart later where you see the actual numbers of corruption. It's not what I'm showing you here. These are just maybe 10 or 15 examples of corruption in each of these sections. But this is espionage. And this is something that's still in the news today. I kind of cut off the date here, but you'll see this person's name come up in 2018 because this person here is being charged with espionage, crimes against America. So for providing too much information to the Chinese, and for getting free vacations and little things like that. This is the same deal, another espionage guy, only this is out of Virginia. So, the Department of State, the level of corruption can go all the way up to espionage, where actually it would be hard to do espionage with the USCIS. So, what do you think now about somebody telling you that the U.S. government is corrupt, especially everybody that's involved in the fiancé visa process? So that's the end of this topic, proof of corruption, DHS and DOS employees. New topic. So this is the counterattack on Department of Homeland Security and Department of State methodologies. So this meeting that we saw in the C-SPAN video, fiancé visa fraud, is an attempt to tighten down the processes, which would be a good thing if you tighten down the processes and don't let criminals through. But if you tighten down a process of crazy policies and procedures where you can't possibly identify, the target groups, and you're still going to tighten it down, then, who's going to suffer? Tightening down an insane system isn't going to result in a system that works. It's just a tightened down insane system. There's a higher chance that your fiancé is going to get denied because they're tightening down the system. So, and another thing I want to point out here, the United States Senate Committee on Immigration, when they had that meeting on fiancé visa fraud, they invited panel 1, which was a few people that wanted to see the system tightened down because they were victims of a fraudulent overseas fiancé who just wanted citizenship and took advantage of the US citizen. The Senate committee failed to invite, the 90, I put 95, but it's more like 98% of the population that uses this system, and that's legitimate fiancés and their US citizen petitioners. So nobody actually had a bona fide relationship and is in a happy marriage now was invited to speak. Because the Senate, they just invited people that would serve their cause. They want to tighten down the system. So they didn't hear, most Americans who use this system, this is on the bottom here, feel that the fiancé visa process is already too full of uncertainty to contend with. So, the one thing that we all agree on, the major thing that we are assembled for is the security risk to the United States, because by not being able to get to the target groups and just denying legitimate couples, we still have the exposure of terrorism. And the word's out, terrorists 1, United States government 0, 14 Americans dead. And that's just the first terrorist attack, and the second one is imminent. It's going to come. So another thing that we agree on is that the best immigrants for this country are handpicked by American citizens in form of fiancés, from citizens that are citizens of other countries. So this is, there's, as time goes on, there's more and more and more international travel, and I don't think that's in this presentation, it's in the bigger one. But international travel goes up and up every year. So more Americans are going abroad. We have Americans that are going to college overseas. I was an international student. I went to college overseas. But we have that, it's increasing all the time. And in people that work for global corporations and go overseas for assignments, maybe you take a promotion to be some kind of a, middle upper manager of some kind of a production or some kind of facility overseas, and you happen to meet, a lady overseas. If you want to get married, you're going to have to go through this process. So this continues, every day, and we think that these people that are handpicked to be, U.S. citizens are, as a group. I mean, we have all kinds of people in our group. We have, members of the USCIS. We have members of the Department of State that are on our side. We have ICE people that are on our side. We have senators. We have hundreds of couples, that are part of our group. And we have watchdog organizations and in the media, and we're growing, and we'll grow more when we get some videos up on YouTube. But we all happen to think that, these hand-picked visas, we can't, together, we haven't even tried this, but I seriously doubt if the people in our ranks could decide on some kind of immigration policy, because that's a hot topic that's really, that really results in a hot debate wherever you are. So, but one thing we agree on is, the best citizens are the ones that we as Americans go overseas and we pick out. So, regardless of what other immigration policies there are, this is a great way to do it. We send people that, overseas, and they pick out a partner. So this is I'm doing an analogy here. You can read through this. This is just my whining about, none of the, this is a scenario where I talk about juries looking at a trial. And this is what happened here. We had the senators watching a meeting where they brought in 2 panels of people to speak, but none of the senators were around for the whole meeting. So, we think that, for some reason, the U.S. Senate Committee on Immigration didn't realize they're seeing a smoke and mirrors show by the leadership team, the Department of Homeland Security, USCIS, and Department of State, U.S. Consulates. We think they did see a smoke and mirror show. Now, why didn't they think so? At the end, when we listened to Cruz and Tillis talk, we thought those 2 guys surely thought they were watching a smoke and mirror show, because they questioned and said, what, could it happen again? Could the terrorists get into the country again? And, the leadership team answered there were no indicators of national security. And, that's their way of saying, yes, it can happen again. So we just look at this whole meeting as a smoke and mirror show, and I don't know how anyone could watch the entire video, the C-SPAN video, and not agree with us. So what we're doing here is getting some opinions. So this is the U.S. Senate Committee on Immigration. So we talked about a couple of these people before. The membership changes. I have Cornyn here as the chair instead of Grassley. Durbin is a ranking member, but Feinstein was a ranking member because this is a different time. I can't imagine Durbin has, Senator Feinstein's like, she's like 80 something. She's been in Congress since since George Washington. Anyway, these people, we looked up to see what colleges they went to. So it turns out that, 4 of them went to Harvard. Because why? Because they're senators, 4 of them went to Georgetown, another prestigious school. 1 of them went to Virginia, and 1 of them went to Stanford. So these are pretty prestigious schools. So, what do you think we did with that? Well, we wrote to the Department of Psychology and the Department of Statistics at these schools and said, hey, Department of Psychology, what do we do first? Okay, so here we wanted to show these schools. We say by using statistical indicators to find a population that avoids the indicators, and by using unqualified entry-level immigration officers for psychological evaluations when they have no training at all in psychology. So we wanted to ask these schools of the Senate committee, because that's the committee that watched that put on this smoke and mirror show. And we went to the universities and said, hey, what do you think about this? And we got some guidance back. So That's still a work in progress, and I didn't want to show that what we have so far, but I can tell you that I've been schooled a little bit in statistics and in psychology, and these people agree with us. You just can't do this. You can't use any kind of known fundamental basis in statistics and try to look for a population using indicators when the target population that you're looking for avoids indicators. It just can't be done. A 12-year-old should know that. So, and the same thing with the psychology. You can't just, all of our people that are into psychology, and let's go down a couple pages now. These are a couple other psychology organizations, the American Psychological Association and the Association for Psychological Science. And then we have SCORE, because we are consultants, and this is basically some consultants getting together to form a consulting organization. So it's a company. So we got some SCORE advice in here. But everybody agrees that that from a psychological aspect, you can't ask three questions. You can't have somebody who's not trained in psychology ask three questions and be able to pick out a terrorist. I mean, we know we're 0 for 1. As hard as it is to believe that terrorists from San Bernardino went into an interview and didn't know anything about her fiance, because she didn't need to know anything about her fiance, because it's, their culture that, they can have arranged marriages. So she didn't know anything about her fiance. She lied about her address. We don't have a robust infrastructure overseas to verify addresses. So interview, entry-level Department of State, U.S. consulate officer. Hey, you look good to me. You have no indicators. Here you go. Welcome to the United States. Pick out a good gun. So that's the end of that topic with the counterattack on their methodology. So their methodologies are just crazy, crazy bad. They don't make any sense. Nobody would support it. They don't have a sound basis in any kind of science or any kind of, in the field of psychology and in the field of statistics. There's no fundamentals that are being met here by the methodologies. They're just crazy. So that's the end of this topic. So the next topic here is the counterattack on senators and representatives. So we spent some time before trying to show you the volume of corruption inside of the Department of State and inside of the Department of Homeland Security. And under this Homeland Security, we showed you corruption in the USCIS and in ICE. And now we're going to show you what senators are, senators that are corrupt. This probably isn't going to be, require a stretch of anybody's imagination to think that senators and representatives are corrupt. So, what I have here, this is a little graphic I have on the right, where this is just an insane circle, circle of insanity here. So up at the top, DHS, DOS unable to target groups. They're unable to identify target groups. The indicator system identifies only legit couples. Consulate denies legit couples. Legit couples call their senator and say, hey, help, senator, we got denied. We have no idea why. Senators send form letters. So, senators, they don't put much effort into stopping this cycle of insanity. Form letters have no effect. So this insane cycle here of the Department of Homeland Security and Department of State, what it requires is just, the indifference of senators also contributes to the cycle. So the side on the right here is the DHS and DOS. Side on the left here is senators. But, they all contribute to this cycle. So it requires arrogance, incompetence, and corruption in the Department of Homeland Security and Department of State, and just indifference as senators. Senators, if they put any effort into this, they could stop this cycle. And we'll get into that. So, here's an example where, I don't think this was pointed out to the senators. These are just two letters that we have. I don't even know if they go together. Well, yeah, the one on the left is policy for 221G. The one on the right was a letter to a senator from some consular somewhere in the Department of State in some other country. So what we have on the left is the policy for 221G. After submitting documentation, your visa application can then be processed to conclusion to determine whether you qualify for a visa. You have 1 year from the date you were refused. On the right, you're supposed to have a year to get the documentation to them, but this consular officer denied the case under Section 221G, which it says right there, clearly not following policy. And they denied the case and said they're going to return the visa packet to the USCIS. So a senator ought to be able to look at this and say, hey, here's a policy on the left. Here's what happened on the right. Gee, I'm only a senator's, what do they call these people? The manager of constituent services. If I were you, I would avoid even talking to somebody like that. Try to get through to a higher level person in the Senate office, because the director of constituent services is somebody who's going to be, let's say for a Senate office, it's going to be somebody who resides in your state. Try to get a hold of somebody in Washington and say, hey, this is a serious thing here. It's a denied fiance visa. These should not happen. Don't leave it up to some part-time college kid. So what we're saying here, senators and representatives ought to do their job and question a fiance visa. These should never happen. Your background check was approved. You are a US Citizen Petitioner, and you cleared your background check with the CIA and FBI. You're crime-free. You're a legitimate person. Why the hell would they think you're a criminal? You don't have any criminal. It's like a policeman coming to your door and putting you under arrest for being a criminal. What do you mean? I'm not a criminal. I've been crime-free all my life. It doesn't matter. They can come to your door and arrest you. So this is the same thing. A senator can just say, yeah, we don't care. You're just, you voted for us, thanks, but in the meantime, we're not going to let you talk to a senator. But like I said, this should never happen. And here I say the consulates are the most arrogant and corrupt because they write letters like this. If you've gone through this package, I have some letters coming back from the USCIS about denials. And, when they deny you, they tell you what's wrong. I've seen some of these, like, criminal history. They say that, they actually tell you that you can get a waiver. Or if they write back and say you were denied because of your income, they actually tell you can get a waiver. The Department of State is the most arrogant and corrupt in this whole process because they don't tell you anything. They send these letters to you and say, we're demigods and you're not. So anyways, all kinds of populations, target populations, terrorists, human trafficking victims, sham marriages, internal boo-boos, they're all getting into the United States and becoming US citizens. But, somebody's getting denied. So who's getting denied? You just have to do the math here. So